Thank you all for joining us. To start today's program, I would like to introduce Michele Powers, a member of the Women Rainmakers Board, who will serve as the moderator for today's program. Michele, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. And welcome to all the Rainmakers around the country as we turn to our program today, Cutting Tall Poppy Syndrome Down to Size, Creating Work Cultures that Embrace Ambitious Women. I would initially like to, sorry about that, getting the slides going. I'd like to thank our sponsors, initially, the Law Practice Division, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Real Property Trust and Estate Section, the Solo, Small Firm, and General Practice Division, the Tort Trial and Insurance Practice Section, as well as the Young Lawyers Division. We appreciate all of you joining. The Rainmakers mission, just to give you a high overview of what we do, is to educate professional women about marketing and business development, to provide mentoring opportunities for members, as well as to provide networking opportunities to build personal and professional relationships. To find up-to-date information regarding our initiatives, you can go to the ABA Women Rainmakers homepage. The URL is listed here. And please follow us on social media. You can join our conversations on Facebook, Twitter, and the Women Rainmakers LinkedIn group. So we have a really amazing panel today. Joining me are Paulette Brown, Emily Logan Stedman, and Kate Harmon. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves in a moment. As David said, I'm Michele Powers. I'm the current chair of the Attorney Wellbeing Committee, as well as a transformational executive and team coach, consultant, and trainer. I recently completed an 18-month certification program on empowering women coaching, which really is a part of what led me to create this program, because I really am very passionate and care about women and gender diversity initiatives, as well as simply creating cultures in law firms that help everyone to do their best and live their fullest lives. And with that, I'd like to invite Paulette Brown to welcome Paulette, and I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Michele, and thank you everyone for joining into this important program this afternoon. I'm Paulette Brown, and I am the first woman of color to lead the ABA, and I also was president of the National Bar Association as well. I am a fierce advocate for all things that are inclusive and causing people to believe that they belong, and for equitable solutions. Some say that if you cut my wrist rather than blood, little D's and I's would come out. But, you know, I enjoy educating people, especially people who believe that they are well-intended, on issues around implicit bias, the issue that we're talking about today, and related issues. So thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. I welcome Kate Harmon, and could you please introduce yourself, Kate?
Of course. Thank you, Michele, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Michele said, I am Kate Harmon. I am a litigation partner with the law firm Diminish, Friedlander, Copeland, and Aronoff, based out of their Delaware office. I'm also the current president of the Delaware State Bar Association. I am about 75% of the way through my one-year term in that role. I am a champion of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That has been something I focused on in the decade or so I've been involved in the State Bar Association. I also involve myself in activities that advance those ideals in the community and in my firm. And as the slide notes, I was a fellow and a pathfinder with the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity over the past few years.
Thank you, Kate. And I'd like to welcome Emily Logan Stedman to our panel. And Emily, would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's an honor to be on this panel with such esteemed women leaders who lead people like me every day in what they do. I am a partner at Hush Blackwell out of the Milwaukee office. I practice commercial litigation. And alongside that, I have developed a passion and a voice around mental health and well-being for attorneys. I've deemed myself an advocate for lawyer well-being. I have a growing community on LinkedIn where I talk almost daily about how to find mental health and well-being in law, and particularly in big law, and how to have better mindsets around being a female and surviving and thriving in big law. My work in mental health and well-being started first with myself and then through the Wisconsin State Bar as president of the Young Lawyers Division and then a co-chair of a committee for the Wisconsin Task Force on Lawyer Well-being. And I am grateful to be here today.
Thank you, Emily. And I will say you should check out Emily's LinkedIn posts because they're great. Really always enjoy those, Emily.
Thank you.
So the overview for what we're going to be covering today, really first off, initially, what exactly is tall poppy syndrome and how does it show up? What does it feel like? What does it look like? Because a lot of people, they're not, the biggest question I have is like, well, what are we talking about? The real impacts of TPS on women professionally and personally, as well as the organizational impacts on the bottom line that you see from the tall poppy syndrome. We'll also turn to, and what we're hoping that you'll come away from this program with is not only an increased awareness of what tall poppy syndrome is, but also some key strengths and practices to develop to embrace your ambition and maintain your well-being as an individual, and also organizational practices that can support women to become fearless tall poppies that thrive. So what really is tall poppy syndrome? It comes through when I first learned about this, I heard this name back in 2017, 2018. And it was really interesting to me because I hadn't known that there was a name that went along with what I had experienced. And here's a simple definition of it. Tall poppy syndrome occurs when people are attacked, resented, disliked, criticized, or cut down because of their achievements or success. It really is what I think of as an ambition penalty for women. And it is pretty ubiquitous. The tall poppy, that name comes out of, I think it originally, from what I've seen in the early studies that were around 20 years ago, it came out of Australia. And it really refers to the agricultural process of, you have this field of poppies and the farmers wanted to have uniformity. And so any time that a bloom would rise up above the rest of the field, it would chop it off. And that's really, so that's what we're talking about today. And the fact is that there was a recent research that came out about a year ago that brought this again to my attention, done by Dr. Ramit Bilan, who is the founder of Women of Influence, which is the Canadian organization. And it's the cost of ambition. And you can see the URL there if you're interested in going there. But she really found in her research, and she's done several of these, that it was really this syndrome is ubiquitous for women around the world. Almost 90% of women across 103 countries experience TPS at work. And how does it happen? And we're going to be our panelists are going to be talking and sharing about where they've seen this show up for them and for others, so that you can get a real sense of it. But there, it shows up with achievements being downplayed. You're left out of meetings and discussions, or your contributions are ignored. Your achievements are also dismissed, as well as others taking credit for your work. 60.5% of the women surveyed believe they would be penalized if they're perceived as ambitious at work, which is really, of course, then the organizational impacts of that are significant if you have people not living up to their potential and being afraid to really rise up. So in looking at who does the cutting, initially there was an assumption that it would be women who were keeping women in line. We tend to be pretty good at that. It's sort of how we've raised. It's a part of the culture, what's baked into us, and which is part of why it's so important to have these discussions. But what the research found is that actually at work, men in leadership positions were more likely to penalize or undermine women due to their success. Women were more likely to cut down their peers or colleagues. And also half of women in the surveys experienced TPS outside of work and said that their friends were responsible for keeping them in line so that they were not too much or did not shine their light as much. So that is really just an overview of the research. And what I'd like to do is to invite Paulette to start off the discussion and sharing on, how have you seen tall poppy syndrome show up? What are your experiences with that you can share? And and help us understand it better.
Thanks so much, Michele. So, as you were going through all of the various statistics and who engages in this cutting process, it caused me to think of a number of things, and also caused me to reflect on something that we talked about earlier, and that is having a name for it. Because I'm certain that people have experienced everything that I'm about to identify, but did not really know what to call it. Some of us, for years have called it microaggressions, but we know that it's something really beyond microaggressions. But I know that from a personal standpoint, it's happened to me many times. And it happened to me in a firm that I was in when I was president of the American Bar Association. Every time there was something that was newsworthy that had to be published, while I was president, there was also someone in my firm who was president-elect of a state bar. And every time there was a press release that they had to do related to something I did as president of the ABA, the head of marketing would also insert, and so is the president-elect of the state bar. And so it was, I could never have a release or statement to go out that was only about me, that this other white guy was always included. And he recognized it, and other people recognized it as well. And I didn't realize he recognized it until he actually became president and asked me whether I wanted to be included in his press release. But as I reflect on it, I thought that was nice of him to say that. But as I think about it also, he had sufficient power that perhaps he could have said something in the moment. And I also think about, sometimes it's not really intentional at all. Sometimes, I'll tell you another circumstance. Sometimes people just don't have an understanding. I was the first one in my family to go to college and to law school. And when I graduated from college, everyone was so happy. It's like, why do you have to do this next thing? And I don't think that they meant any harm, but in essence, that's what they were doing. I should be happy with that because they were so happy about it. But I've also seen it happen in other circumstances to other people. For example, when you talk about women in peer-to-peer, you know, I have heard administrative assistants and secretaries will say that horrible behavior is fine for men, but when a woman engages in a quote unquote aggressive behavior, that's not acceptable. And they will say that, and they will treat the woman lawyer less than because of that. So I think it really goes across the spectrum. And I think that, you know, you also have to consider the intersectionality of particular things when it's both a woman and a woman of color, because sometimes because of people's biases, they think that they have lower expectations, lower standards sometimes for people of color. And I've been heard people to say that to a person who isn't doing well, who's achieving, your standards are too high. You need to lower your standards. You know, and so to me, that says that we don't expect you to do this well. And you are really kind of showing off, really outside of your lane by being so good. And yet on the flip side, if you're not good, we don't want you. So it's really a double-edged sword. So I think that, you know, this you know, cutting you down to size could really manifest itself in many different ways. And I think that we haven't always viewed it that way, but I think that it's really good to bring it to everyone's attention so that it can be recognized. And I know we're going to talk about this later as to some of the things that we can do to interrupt it.
Michele and Paulette, we have a question in the Q&A. And I think one or both of you may be able to answer it. Michele, just from your review of this study, if you know whether or not there was a breakdown on how this plays out for women of color. And Paulette, I think you've touched on this in our conversations in preparing for today, and even just a little bit now. But if there's anything you would add regarding your particular experience as a woman of color and this syndrome.
I don't think we have enough time, Emily, for me to talk about all of the different experiences of what people have said to me directly. You know, you know, the one example I already gave, where the person deemed it necessary not to let me have just my moment to shine. But there have also been many instances, which I know a lot of people do, is that when they have awards or receive recognitions, they don't necessarily like to talk about it because they don't want that attention drawn to them because of fear of repercussions. So I've had things where I've been involved with, you know, the Garden State Bar, the National Bar, etc. And, you know, then I would be looked at askance. Well, how do you have time to do your real work if you're involved in those things when other people have opportunities to engage in other activities? And, you know, and so sometimes I would just stop sharing. If I was getting an award, I wouldn't invite anybody in the firm. And so you sort of self-edit yourself. And you sort of pull back when you really shouldn't do those things. And so you really can't really be your true self when you're kind of forced to do that, fearing that there will be repercussions as a result. And you know, just the other thing is just people having lower expectations of what you're capable of doing. I actually had people to come up to me after my term was over as president of the ABA and said, "Oh, you really grew into the position." And I said to myself, "You're so mediocre. You have no idea. You know, you can't even compare yourself to me." That's what I was thinking, but you don't say those things. You just sort of smile and move on because you want to be as productive as you can. But I know that would not have been said to a man. Also, when I was negotiating something for the ABA, there were people who said to the executive director, completely ignoring the fact that I was in the room, "Is she going by herself to do that?" You know, so you know, like I said, Emily, I could go on and on and on and on, but I think that we have to have people who are willing to call things out when they see and hear it. And I have reached a point in my career that I am very able to do it for others. And I do that whenever I do see something that was not calling it the tall poppy syndrome in many of the instances, but it really was, because people make assumptions and presumptions about people and what they're capable of doing, or what they think that they should be capable of doing, more importantly, and believing that they should not do the things that they are capable of doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those examples and that fear of sharing, of standing out for your accomplishments, your awards. I know that certainly is very real. It's something that I've experienced. And I will say, just to answer the question about the survey, there was not a breakdown that I saw in reviewing it for the experience of women of color.
But the survey did say that they interviewed women of color were a part of the survey.
Yes, yeah, they were a part of it. And I would like to just invite, as we're talking about this, invite people to jump on the chat and let us know about your experiences or witnessing tall poppy syndrome. What did it look like? How did it feel? Because you're sharing, this is a way of, it may help somebody else to see how it's shown up and impacted them.
I will say, in one of the reports, Left Out and Left Behind, it does specifically talk about the different challenges that women of color face.
Right. That's yeah. And that's available on Women in the Profession.
Yes, it is. It's available. Okay. It's available at the website.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great resource. Thank you.
The chat is turned off, but people are being quite active in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. So Kate, would you be willing to just share some of your experiences or thoughts on the tall poppy syndrome?
Of course. I imagine nearly everyone who is joining us this afternoon has had experiences where they've been left out of the room of meetings or discussions that they deserved and earned a spot in. And certainly that's happened to me. Certainly we've all had experiences where your accomplishments, your achievements, whether it's on a case or on a deal or what have you, are well overlooked, but the focus then turns to sort of what you didn't do or what you could have done better without any sort of recognition of all that you accomplished. But one thing that came to mind when I was thinking about this that happened at the very outset of my career as a lawyer, sort of shaped even how I show up to practice today. And I think it's bound up in this tall poppy syndrome. And that is, I was a baby lawyer, first law firm I worked for out of law school. Been there for a few months. It was coming up on performance review time. I had really thrown myself into the work and learning the practice that the firm was engaged in. I had come up with on my own, sort of without being asked, new tools to manage our caseload and to sort of deal with all of the different moving parts in the office. I really established relationships across offices. I really just worked really hard to deliver stellar work product, all of the things that you're supposed to do when you're setting out. So as a child of the 80s and 90s, I like to always do the best and strive to be the best, and was really looking forward to the constructive feedback at my performance review. Partners were coming in from the main office, very excited about the whole thing, to hear how I could be doing better as a lawyer. And I sit down and everyone's smiling at me, so I'm feeling really good about how this is going to go. And the woman founding partner of the firm starts out with, "Gosh, you just have such a great personality. Like, we just really appreciate how you engage with people in the firm and people, with clients and things of that nature. And just, you're just so likable." And I guess that's a good thing to hear, but that's that's not how I am as a lawyer. That's not my work product. That's not my accomplishments, my achievements, sort of. And it really did, looking back, shape how I practice, how I show up as an attorney, the persona that I bring with me into the room as a lawyer. It's always in the back of my mind that I have to be this sort of cheerful, hopeful, like cheerleader for the rest of the team. And whatever my work product is always going to be secondary to how I show up as a person. And I don't think that I could say that about any man I've ever worked with as an attorney, in terms of that he would prioritize his persona over his deliverables. So that was something that that came up for me when I was thinking about this.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that share. Because that is another way that this really shows up. I'm cognizant of the time, and so I'm going to move into just so what are the, as far as for the impacts, and we're already talking about these. But I'm curious, Emily, do you have an experience or some thoughts to share on this topic?
Yes, I absolutely resonate with a lot of what's been said here and what's been said in the Q&A, and the chat is turned on now. So we can even see a comment from Monica. I think people are really relating. I think for me as a young attorney or younger attorney, where I felt it was where right out the gate, the top one here, internalization and self-censorship. I felt the need to fit a mold and to maybe tamp down my personality, tamp down my ambition, because I felt different from, the good old boys club. And that kept me, I think, from what Paulette was describing, from being myself and bringing my whole self and my whole personality to the table out of fear of being bossy, being perceived as the other B word, right? Because I had goals and ambition and believed in myself. I think another thing that happens is firms sometimes think they're rewarding ambition by giving women more to do, but what they're giving us more to do of is not always the substantive work. It is the administrative or quote unquote women's work. So a lot of coaching, mentoring, being the face of things external to the firm, all of which, yes, I personally enjoy doing, but I have other skills, to Kate's point as well, that I equally enjoy and, that bring dollars in the door to the firm. And so that is how I've experienced here. One question, Michele, we got was, this sounds a lot like sexism or queen bee syndrome. How is this different? My answer to that would be it's related. This feels like much more of an official and studied name for all of those things we've likely experienced related to sexism and queen bee syndrome.
Yeah, and I would say that according to the study, the top drivers for it were for people cutting tall poppies down were jealousy, sexism or gender stereotypes, right? How you're supposed to be as a woman, as a female, and a lack of confidence or an insecurity in the person doing the cutting. And I would I'd like to ask Paulette if you would what do you think as far as for the origins of this, and where, how, the fact that it shows up so prevalently in our society?
I think that people have been conditioned in certain ways. I think that they've been conditioned to think certain ways. It really, I think, more than sort of a queen bee syndrome, it has a lot to do with how people are are trained to think about certain things. And so that's why you need some different kind of structures. You actually need to tear down some things and rebuild some structures, because I think that, you know, historically people are taught to process and think different ways. I think about I was talking to someone about a standardized test and how they were structured before. When I was in elementary school, a standardized test would ask you, who is the person who is going off to work? And the correct answer was the white man with the briefcase. He was the one going off to work. Well, you know, so, but that's not necessarily, that was presumably the experience of other people or of the majority at that time. And so I think that this type of thinking has been so ingrained in people for such a long period of time, and including women who then impose it on other women, and that thinking that there should be certain limitations as to what it is that women should do, and even greater limitations on women of color and what it is that they're capable of doing and what they should be doing. So I think a lot of it is really learned behavior, and I think it goes back for centuries in this learned behavior. And then the subliminal message that we constantly get, that we don't necessarily realize that we're receiving through television, through magazine ads, through what's literally in the counter aisles in the magazines when we're checking out of the grocery stores. So the messages are always being delivered as to what roles people should have, and more importantly, what their limitations should be, and where they should go and how far they should go. So I think that, you know, that's sort of what's driving it. And that's why education is so important. It's so important that people understand what this is, that we call it out by its name, so that it can be adequately and substantively addressed.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree that it's, you know, it's one of those, it's something that is, you know, we grow up in the soup or the water, and we don't even realize how we're limiting ourselves, or the, you know, how we may actually be unintentionally limiting someone else.
Right.
And a big part of that I see is it's also a fixed mindset, right? So if you're thinking that if somebody else rises up, that's taking away from you, that's the tall poppy cutting is really a symptom of that. Whereas if we can begin to have a more growth oriented mindset, seeing opportunities as not zero sum, but actually, you know, that old adage of, you know, rising tides lifts all boats.
Right.
There's plenty to go around. And the fact is that if we allow the tall poppies to thrive, then the rest of us can grow up alongside them, right? It raises everybody up.
Right.
I'd like to bring in a little bit of a different focus on the double bind that women fight as far as for ambition versus a personal life and motherhood, right? And we're talking about being able to step into our ambition, to embrace it. And how do we do that in a way that is healthy, and that where we can really thrive? And how do we help support each other? Again, that idea of all the poppies growing up together. And Kate, could you talk a bit about, I specifically want to talk about Vanessa Ford and her story.
Certainly. And I'll just offer a little bit of background for the benefit of our audience, because I'm not sure how many of you heard about the tragedy of Vanessa Ford. And I'll admit that I actually, for my own mental health, try to stay away from the news generally. So I had not heard about her case until recently when preparing for this panel. But Vanessa was a mother, she was a wife, and among other things, she was a senior equity partner with a big law firm based out of London. it's ranked on the Global 200. So we can have an idea of what that culture is like, generally what the demands are of a senior equity partner in a firm like that. She passed away in September of last year, about a week after she and her team had closed a major deal that had her working 18-hour days for weeks and weeks on end. And after her death, an inquest was conducted, as it can happen in the UK. And the inquest determined that her cause of death was the consumption of a significant amount of alcohol while undergoing an acute mental health crisis. And after she had consumed that significant amount of alcohol, she had allowed herself to drop onto train tracks from a bridge overpass where she was later struck by a train. And just to be clear, the coroner in that inquest found that there was no evidence that she intended to take her own life. But that was sort of the culmination of all of the factors leading up to the incident. And what really struck me in learning about Vanessa's situation is that during the inquest, her husband had described her as good at everything, and that she was rooted in perfectionism, which is something I imagine a lot of us here today can relate to. But things that he also pointed out were that the deal she was working on, those 18-hour days for weeks on end, it was all consuming for her. She felt guilty for not spending much time with their children. Family holidays were often interrupted by long work calls. Her father had died the previous year, and she hadn't had time to properly grieve that loss due to the work demands on her time. Something that really stood out to me was she was the only woman on that deal team for her side. And her husband also emphasized her exceptional dedication to her job, often sacrificing family time and her personal well-being for work demands, which I'm sure we can all relate to. And immediately preceding her death, she had actually called a mental health professional to talk about depression and alcohol use, but wasn't able to get an appointment. The manager at her firm said that Vanessa never raised any concerns about her work-life balance. I mean, how could she and why would she? Particularly on a team where she was the only woman. And her manager also stressed that Vanessa was very positive and proud of the work she'd done, which to me sounded a lot like this cheerleader role, the sort of idea that your persona, your personality has to lead your work product, even as a senior equity partner at a major law firm. But as I said, what really struck me, what I want to circle back to is this fact that she was the only woman on her team, which we all can imagine was extremely isolating. And as I said, why would she, how could she sort of raise these concerns about work-life balance when there's no one on her team that could possibly understand where she's coming from? Who is she going to vent to? How is she going to get support when she feels that crushing guilt, which I imagine a lot of us know well, about missing bedtime or a soccer game or a band concert or just being home with her kids in the evening after school and before bed, and on a team with without anyone who understands who's going to fill in for her when she needs to just go be present in her family life. So I think the questions that were posed by Michele were, how do we embrace our ambition and thrive? And how, as women, do we support each other and move towards a change in mindset and culture? I think I can take the second question first. It feels a little easier to answer. And things that come to mind for me about how do we support each other more. I've been very lucky to find a group of women in my firm, in my office, who we all have very similar life experiences in terms of our family structure and sort of our roles in our family and our roles professionally. And one thing that really keeps me going is them and our group chat, our group text message where we're just exchanging memes multiple times a day and sort of venting that way and getting a little bit of a laugh. And that sisterhood, that just knowing that there are people who get it, I've found to be really helpful. And one thing that came to mind is outside of the workplace, but I think is really important to changing culture long-term, is just how we raise our kids. I have a daughter, she's in 6th grade, I imagine a lot of us can recall that middle school isn't the easiest time, particularly around peer interactions. There's a lot of dynamics that have to be managed. And because of larger circumstances, there have been some struggles for us recently. And I was talking to a friend about it, and he said, you know, he remembered, you know, his daughter's a little older, but he remembered how when his daughter was in middle school, just like girls can be really mean to each other. And it made me pause for a minute because that's actually not what she's experiencing. And when I was thinking about why she wasn't experiencing it, because I certainly did experience that, but thinking about why she's not experiencing that, you know, and she's 13 or she's 12, not 13 yet. So I monitor her text messages with her friends. I have a fair idea of sort of how they interact with each other. I overhear them in the car, in our home, things of that nature. And what really strikes me about the peer interactions going on right now is that these girls hold each other accountable. They're not mean to each other. They hold each other accountable for perhaps poor behavior or poor choices, but they also are really, really good at lifting each other up. And sort of highlighting each other's accomplishments and holding each other up and just coming to each other's defense when something happens with another friend. It's a beautiful thing to see. And thinking about it in the context of tall poppy syndrome and sort of what we can do to shift the culture, I think it's really how we parent not only our daughters, but also our sons. It's important for all of our kids to see as women that we hold each other up, that we are defending each other, and that we can do a lot to diminish this idea of, you know, women sort of going after each other, because I don't think that that's actually the case anymore. And then I'll say one more thing, and I don't want to monopolize our time, but I do hear a lot sort of what I think of as a holdover of older attorneys, older women attorneys saying, well, I had to deal with X, Y, and Z, so you should too, or she should too, or she should stop complaining because I had it harder. And I really think that there's no shift that's going to happen until we abandon that collectively, and until we hold each other accountable to abandon that collectively. Because if we are always going to think that, well, it was hard for me, so it's got to be hard for you, the idea is to make it easier and better for people as we go along, not to haze people, essentially, just because we were hazed.
That is absolutely so true, Kate, that last point that you raised, and you still hear situations like that even now with women saying that basically if they don't say that this is what I had to go through, they also say in a quote unquote helpful way, if you want to be successful, you may have to do these things in the light of the men who are in charge. So it's not so much that I had to do it, but it's what's expected of you to do in order to be successful. And it becomes really a double-edged sword, because sometimes when you do those things, then you get accused of being too aggressive, and you get it on the flip side at home or from your neighbors and peers that you're not paying enough attention to your children, or from your family members, you're not paying enough attention to your family. And it could be from parents or siblings or whomever, your neighbors, that, you know, so, you know, it's almost like sometimes a no-win situation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could not agree more. Particularly Kate, I was typing in the chat as you were speaking that it is a hazing mentality. And I think for so long, either people didn't realize that it was a cycle could be broken. For some people, they don't want to break the cycle. And for others, they don't know how to break the cycle. But by talking about it and bringing awareness to it, we will break the cycles in our sort of sphere of influence. One question we got in the Q&A, are a couple questions are related to this idea of promoting yourself. And so how can you promote yourself or take credit for your achievements in a way that feels comfortable for you and doesn't garner sort of the negative reaction or negative attention? Anyone have thoughts? I haven't been great at this. I think for me, it took honestly changing firms and getting a fresh start to sort of find my footing and say, I changed firms once, I can change firms again. I'm going to be myself here. And I'm going to stand up for myself and remind everyone of all that I do. But it is still very hard for me. I think the best way is just to practice. Start small, maybe telling your spouse or friend or parent of something you're proud of, and becoming more vocal about things over time.
Yeah, I agree. It takes some practice. It also really helps if you have allies in the room, creating those alliances with each other. That's a big reason why it's really so important to actually actively engage in supporting other women, other minorities, and being able to, so that sometimes it's easier for people to hear praise about you from somebody else. It shouldn't be that way, but sometimes that can help start to create a shift in the culture. There is, the perfectionism that we really have in spades in the legal culture. Its root cause is the fear of being judged, right? That perfectionism, that drive to, fear. And there's a really, in our culture as well as lawyers, there's this fear of being seen as weak, not asking for help, not reaching out. And that really is something that we need to normalize, the fact that it's okay to ask for support. And that's and we can do that with our peers. Kate, I love the fact that you've got a chat text group going, because if you don't find it within your firm, find it outside of your firm. Places like the ABA, that's where I really reached and developed some really amazing support systems and friendships with others that can help you to be able to talk about your successes and to be able to see that there are, amazing women who are mothers, who are also amazing trial attorneys, and they're really at the top of their game. And meeting those women and meeting men who also really are incredibly supportive, right? And in understanding that to Emily's point that, sometimes it does require a shift or a switch in firms. That is one of the metrics that the study, Tall Poppy study, showed, that as far as for organizational impacts, not only do you have sort of the impacts on productivity, you have burnout, you have disengagement, specifically because of the tall poppy syndrome, and you also have over 50% of the women who experience tall poppy syndrome will end up leaving. So that's another reason why, just from a bottom line perspective on this, it really will pay for organizations to start being more mindful about what they can do to create systems of support and to educate people. And Paulette, turn it to you for some ideas on this for organizations.
So I think that, one thing is that, as I've spoken to people, many organizations have no clue as to what tall poppy syndrome is. So I think that a lot of education is necessary. I think that people need to look internally and assess the trajectories of the women in their organizations and sort of do a backwards look to see how they've been treated. People who have children, who are caregivers, people who have, look at the work product that they've done and whether they have treated them in the same way that men have been treated. And I think that we also have to educate the women in the organizations too, and what their expectations are, and that, for example, they should not automatically default to men when there's something that is a high level position or assignment that that women are capable of doing it too, because women sort of have that internal default as well in terms of who they think should be at a higher level as opposed to sort of the middle ground. But I think that, you know, primarily it's a real educational process, and it's going to have to be a real culture shift in organizations, because they have been doing this for so long and doing it without the understanding so much of the negative impact that it can have on their business model. So, you know, it's really to the benefit of the organization to really take a deep dive into this. And sometimes you can't move forward if you don't look at what you've done in the past. So I think that that's important to take a look back at what you've done, your patterns and your practices before you can move forward.
I think I would add to Paulette's point, I think it can be hard, particularly in bigger firms or just the traditional profession that we're in, to feel like change is even possible. And so I like to focus on what I call my sphere of influence. So the four walls of my office within the bigger office are my relationship with associates, and you know, it's maybe trite in 2024, but be the change that I want to see. So I'm mindful of including female attorneys. I'm mindful of, am I falling into that mother hen role on teams where I'm the only woman? Am I speaking up on behalf of female associates who are maybe being questioned in a different way than their male counterparts are being discussed at partner meetings? And there are ways we can exercise some control or autonomy in our small spaces that will ultimately have a bigger impact, and I think change the profession from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are all great, very pragmatic ways of, you know, really bringing change to an organization, because the organizations can do systems and education, but it's up to individuals to really facilitate that change.
Yep. Sometimes
Kate-
I say it's mano y mano.
Right.
That
Kate, do you have any thoughts on this as far as from your perspective?
Organizationally, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. One thing that has worked for me that I try to be intentional about is finding the men in my organization, whether that's my firm or the State Bar Association, whatever it is, the men that I know aren't going to cut me or other women down, but in fact hold us up and help them identify women and accomplishments that should be amplified, you know, to the larger group. And there are a number of men in my firm who are great at that. And so I've tried to just identify those guys over the years and just really work with them to make sure that they have the information, because once they have the information about accomplishments and achievements, it's usually a very easy thing for them to turn around and you know, praise the woman who's made that accomplishment or achievement to a larger group, the people in power, what have you. And so something along those lines in terms of, I guess we could call that managing up to a certain extent, but to a very specific subset of people in your organization could be a way to help address it.
No, thank you. So Emily, how are we doing with questions?
I've been trying to answer some just in the chat or pointing them that we'll be covering them later. We have a few left, and they're pretty specific examples. So, for example, how do you handle jealousy or pettiness from peers who don't seem to have a problem with high-achieving male peers, but act more hostile towards high-achieving female peers?
So I've seen that happen, and I've seen it actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, with administrative personnel treating women differently than they treat the male, you know, associates and female associates. And I think that sometimes it's almost it's not a good situation, but you know, you can actually try having that, you know, initial one-on-one conversation with that particular peer, invite them to participate in a group. It may not always work if that person is so determined that they don't want to see you succeed or feel threatened. And that's generally when it happens, is that that other person feels so threatened by you. And sometimes there's nothing that you can do about it because they lack a confidence in themselves. And you're not able to fix that other person's problem. That person needs some professional help. So, so I think that what we have to do in those instances, if they are not causing you a particular harm, if they're causing you a particular harm, then you have to take some action with regard to reporting it to someone in your organization. But if it's just a situation where they're saying petty things, catty things, I think you distance yourself from that person. But if they're causing you real harm, then it has to be reported because it could be a violation of the law. So
I would just to piggyback on that, because I agree with everything Paulette said, is actually something that Michele told me a couple of years ago. It's still written on my whiteboard, which is to be curious. And so when I encounter those sorts of situations, if it's about me and the pettiness is about me, I typically just move on past it because the stakes feel lower somehow. And that's certainly something I should talk to my therapist about. But with regard to, like, if it's happening about somebody else in my group or my team or organization, whatever it is, I think a good way to approach that is to have that one-on-one and be curious about why it's happening, why that individual may need to tear down women and be petty about their accomplishments as opposed to lifting up men and their accomplishments. And Michele suggested I do that in a different context. I have found it to be a highly successful tool, because when you force people to address you head on and articulate sort of their reasons for things, it allows them to not be defensive, but a little bit more cerebral about it. And I've actually had a lot of good results and outcomes in helping people shift their perspective around situations like this, just by being curious.
I love the fact that you still have that on your whiteboard. Yay! Curiosity is one of the best ways to bring in empathy and to, show that you're actually interested in the person. And that's a great way to end this program. I want to thank Paulette Brown, Emily Logan Stedman, and Kate Harmon for their contributions today. And thank everyone for joining us across the country. And to remind you that hopefully you've enjoyed this Women Rainmakers webinar and you've been able to garner some insight into the tall poppy syndrome and perhaps a takeaway or two on how you can do better, how you can help your organization do better. We do have upcoming 2024 Rainmaker webinars on June 19th, September 19th, and December 11th. They're always at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And if you have any questions that we weren't able to respond to, please, feel free to reach out to the speakers and connect with them. Also, you may connect with our webinar co-chairs, Carol Bass or Vita Jones Richardson, who'd be happy to hear from you about any questions or comments about this webinar or the series in general.
Will the recording be available? Our most common question was, will the recording be available or the slides?
Yes, the slides will be available and the recording, I believe, will be as well. The recording usually gets put up on the Women Rainmakers webinar page, and the slides should be available at the link for registration. So with that, thank you, everybody. And have good success on your rainmaking.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
This concludes today's webinar. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.